The company can't keep ineffective employees. You're simply a waste of money.
That's an interesting choice of words. From now on, the system will continue to operate, but not in the way you expect.
I woke to pressure, noise, and a dull ache that made thinking feel expensive. Machines hummed beside me, steady and indifferent, as if nothing important was happening. Before a doctor spoke, before anyone asked how I felt, Rachel Moore stood near the bed with a tablet tucked to her chest. "Your employment was terminated effective yesterday." She said it calmly, no pause, no explanation, no apology. Just a sentence delivered like a weather update. I tried to speak, my mouth barely worked. My head felt wrapped in fog. I'd been unconscious hours earlier after a medical emergency that dropped me without warning. Paperwork wasn't possible. Consent wasn't possible. Defending myself wasn't possible. None of that seemed to matter to her. My name is Liam Cross. I was the senior operations director for over 10 years. I kept the company's systems from collapsing when leadership chased speed over stability. When things broke, I fixed them. When clients stayed, it was because operations held. I wasn't visible. I was essential. Ethan Blackwell never liked that. Our CEO preferred slides, shaved budgets, and numbers that looked on a screen. To him, people were costs that hadn't been optimized yet. He didn't visit the hospital. He didn't call. He sent a message through human resources. This was a business decision. That was it. While I lay connected to monitors, the company decided I was an expense they could erase. Rachel tapped her tablet, confirmed receipt I couldn't give, and left as efficiently as she arrived. Anger tried to surface, but shock pinned it down. I stared at the ceiling, replaying the words, searching for logic that wasn't there. The timing felt deliberate. The speed felt practiced. This hadn't been a reaction. It had been waiting. Later. As a nurse adjusted a line and lowered her voice, I caught a fragment not meant for me. "They asked what time you went unconscious," she said softly. In that moment, the fog cleared just enough for one thought to settle in. They hadn't fired me because I was replaceable. They fired me because I wasn't awake. Before this goes any further, check in with yourself for a second. If you've been pushing nonstop, promise me you'll schedule a real medical checkup this month. Sometimes the warning signs don't announce themselves. Tell me where you're listening from right now. It helps me remember I'm not alone in this. Stay with me and subscribe if this story speaks to you, because what happened next didn't start in that hospital room, while I lay still in that hospital bed. My mind refused to rest. It drifted backward, replaying years of work that never carried my name. I had been the one keeping the operation upright while others practiced sounding confident. I stabilized systems that were never designed to scale. When a vendor collapsed overnight, I rerouted logistics before dawn. When a regional outage threatened contracts, I stayed until it was fixed. I handled crises quietly so the company could pretend they never existed. Ethan Blackwell stood on stages and spoke about vision. I stayed in conference rooms and made sure his promises didn't implode. Every quarterly review followed the same pattern. Ethan praised leadership alignment and strategic clarity. Applause followed. My work appeared on slides without attribution. When results exceeded projections, Ethan accepted congratulations with a practiced smile. I learned early that credit flowed upward, while responsibility fell wherever it landed. I warned him more than once. I flagged staffing gaps, aging infrastructure, compliance risks that would not forgive arrogance. Ethan waved them away. He preferred optimism to preparation. Fix it later was his version of leadership, and later usually meant me. The pressure accumulated slowly, then all at once. Long stretches without sleep, meals replaced by coffee, calls answered from parking lots and hotel hallways. I told myself it was temporary, that once the next quarter passed, I'd slow down. The company never recorded the overtime. No memo acknowledged the strain. When my body finally failed, it was treated as an inconvenience rather than a consequence. While I was hospitalized, Ethan moved quickly. Emergency meetings replaced concern, spreadsheets replaced people. Discussions weren't about recovery or continuity. They were about exposure, about costs, about timing. I wasn't there to object. That part mattered. An IT technician I'd worked with for years forwarded something by mistake. It arrived without context, a thread buried among system alerts and access requests. I recognized Ethan's tone immediately: efficient, detached, decisive. Once his employment ends, our insurance exposure drops. I read it twice, then again, letting the words settle. That single sentence clarified everything. The hospital room, the rushed termination, the absence of hesitation. This wasn't impatience or indifference, it was calculation. Ethan hadn't erased my role because I stopped being useful. He erased it because my absence made the math cleaner. The work I built kept running, exactly as designed, while he adjusted the numbers to protect himself, lying there, still weak, still connected to machines. I felt something colder than anger take hold. It wasn't loud. It didn't rush. It waited. They thought paperwork would bury me. I didn't argue. I didn't call anyone in anger. I read, page by page, line by line. I let the documents do the talking while my pulse slowed. Shock had burned itself out. What remained was distance. The termination notice was clean, confident, and careless. Signed while I was unconscious, dated while I was legally unable to respond. There was no acknowledgement of incapacity, no pause, no safeguard. Just a decision executed as if silence meant consent. My signature was missing. So was any record of legal representation. No power of attorney, no emergency proxy, no confirmation that I was capable of understanding or disputing what had been done. They assumed absence was enough. That assumption fascinated me. I compared timestamps, system logs, email headers, internal approvals. The story they told themselves was simple: remove the employee, reduce exposure, move on. The story the documents told was different. It spoke in gaps and omissions, in steps skipped because speed felt safer than scrutiny. I didn't raise my voice when I made the call. I dialed Julia Bennett, an attorney who specialized in labor and insurance disputes. We had crossed paths years earlier during a compliance review. She didn't ask how I was feeling. She didn't ask what I wanted. She asked one thing. "What time were you declared incapacitated?" I told her. She went quiet. Not surprised, just precise. She explained what the company had tried to pretend away. Terminating an employee who cannot legally defend themselves is not efficiency. It is exposure, especially when benefits and insurance are involved. After the call, I requested my medical records, not dramatically, formally, the way systems expect to be asked. The nurse returned with a folder thicker than I anticipated. The timeline was clear, uncomfortably clear. I had been declared unconscious 4 hours before the termination was processed, 4 hours before approvals were logged, 4 hours before the decision became irreversible on their end. They hadn't just moved quickly. They had crossed a line while assuming no one would notice. I set the folder down and stared at the ceiling, not searching for comfort or revenge. Understanding had replaced confusion. They believed forms could erase responsibility. They believed paperwork could finish what my body had started. They were wrong. I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. I simply noted the imbalance shift. When truth aligns with documentation, momentum changes direction quietly. I understood then that survival wasn't about strength or outrage. It was about timing, accuracy, and patience. And for the first time since waking up, I knew exactly where this was going. That realization settled deeper than pain, steadier than fear. And it stayed long after the machines kept humming beside me without interruption at all. Many people listen past this part, but if you stayed, you know it matters. Julia didn't raise her voice or soften the truth. She explained it the way professionals do when emotion only creates noise. Terminating an employee who is legally incapacitated is void. It doesn't exist in the eyes of the law. And when that termination is done to avoid insurance liability, it crosses into bad faith. That phrase mattered. Bad faith turns mistakes into intent. She didn't talk about revenge or leverage. She talked about time, paperwork, and motive. Those three things decide outcomes. I didn't need ownership, influence, or allies. I needed records that told the truth and patience to let them speak. We drafted the legal notice together. It was brief, no accusations, no drama. It listed dates, referenced incapacity, and requested preservation of records related to insurance communications. The tone was neutral, almost polite. That was intentional. Precision unsettles people more than anger ever does when it went out. I felt steady, not relieved, not triumphant, controlled. This wasn't a confrontation. It was alignment. Ethan called the next day. His voice carried familiarity, as if we were still playing our old roles. He said this didn't need to escalate. He suggested misunderstandings. He implied consequences. When that didn't work, he warned me about burning bridges. I listened without interrupting. I didn't argue facts or defend my position. I simply told him to speak to counsel. The silence that followed was louder than any threat he'd made. Power shifts rarely announce themselves. They just stop responding. Julia reviewed the internal system logs we'd requested. Approvals, timestamps, access records. She paused longer than usual on one file. Then she said it plainly. He backdated the termination, not by days, by hours. Enough to make it appear compliant, enough to erase the overlap with my incapacity, enough to turn a risky decision into something he believed was clean. It wasn't. That single adjustment transformed a weak defense into exposure. Intent became visible. The system recorded what memory couldn't hide. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt confirmation. Here's the quiet lesson I learned in that moment when someone rushes to document instead of explain. They're already afraid of what the record might show. Ethan hadn't miscalculated because he underestimated me. He miscalculated because he trusted paperwork to behave loyally. Systems don't, they remember. I ended the day the same way I began it, reading carefully and saying very little. Control doesn't come from force. It comes from knowing when the outcome is already decided and letting others discover it at their own pace. I signed the complaint without ceremony. $10 million looked unreal on the page, but the numbers weren't symbolic. They represented lost income, stripped benefits, medical exposure, and punitive damages for acting in bad faith. The filing was calm, factual, and devastating in its simplicity. Once it hit the docket, tension followed immediately. Journalists called the company for comment. Analysts asked why an operations director had been terminated during a medical emergency. The questions weren't hostile yet, just curious, but curiosity spreads faster than anger ever does. Inside the company, panic moved quietly. Board members requested briefings they hadn't needed in years. Compliance officers asked for timelines. Legal requested document holds. Every department wanted to know who approved what and when. No one wanted their name attached to the answer. Ethan went public before anyone advised him to stay quiet. He told investors the lawsuit was exaggerated. He said I was confused, emotional, opportunistic. We'll crush this, he promised, as if confidence could substitute for facts. The statement did more damage than silence ever could. It confirmed intent, posture, and denial in a single breath, privately. His tone shifted. Messages arrived suggesting mediation. Calls hinted at severance adjustments. The numbers climbed and fell as if resolution were an auction. I declined every overture, not out of spite, but because timing matters. You don't interrupt a system while it's correcting itself. The pressure escalated as expected. Shareholders asked about insurance exposure. Partners reviewed contracts. Vendors paused renewals. Every pause carried cost. Every delay invited scrutiny. The company's legal team worked around the clock to contain a narrative that refused to stay contained. Then, the insurer stepped in. The request was formal and unemotional. They wanted the full termination file, all approvals, all correspondence, all timestamps, anything related to employment status and benefit eligibility. The kind of request that doesn't ask questions because it already knows where to look. That single notice shifted the weight of the room. The board stopped speculating. Counsel stopped posturing. Ethan stopped speaking publicly. Insurance companies don't posture. They calculate. I felt the tension peak not in anger, but in silence. Everyone understood what that request meant. The story was no longer about me. It was about exposure, risk, and whether the company had been honest when honesty was inconvenient. The lawsuit had done what it was meant to do. It hadn't threatened. It had invited daylight. I stayed quiet as the process moved forward, letting attorneys speak where I once had. The escalation felt mechanical, predictable, almost dull in its inevitability. Each response triggered another review, another memo, another pause. The company had built systems to optimize efficiency, not accountability, and now those systems were under strain. I didn't celebrate that pressure. I observed it. Watching an organization confront its own records is less dramatic than revenge, but far more final. That reckoning was unavoidable, irreversible, and already underway, long before anyone admitted it out loud. This is where careful listeners lean in. Are you still with me? I learned how fast authority changes when insurance enters the room. The insurer's response didn't arrive with accusations or threats. It came as a notice, precise and impersonal, requesting clarification on employment status, benefit eligibility, and timing discrepancies. They had compared filings. They had checked dates. What the company reported didn't align with medical records or internal logs. Misrepresentation is a clinical word. It sounds small. In practice, it terrifies insurers. They found that my employment status had been altered while I was incapacitated, and that the timing had been blurred to reduce liability. Those are not mistakes. Those are signals. Within days, the coverage was suspended, not adjusted, not renegotiated, suspended entirely. The company lost protection across operations, directors, and key projects. No one announced it publicly. They didn't need to. Phones stopped ringing. Deals paused. Partners asked new questions. Major initiatives froze in place. Contracts that required active coverage could not move forward. Construction halted. Expansion plans vanished from calendars. Everything Ethan had pushed forward with confidence suddenly required approval that no longer existed. That was when he called again. This time. The certainty was gone. His voice rushed, jumping ahead of itself. He asked what it would take to make this disappear. He blamed advisors. He suggested temporary misunderstandings. He said the insurer was overreacting. Panic has a sound, and I heard it clearly. I didn't negotiate. I reminded him that I wasn't the audience anymore. The insurer was behind the scenes. The review expanded. The carrier requested communications related to termination strategy, benefit calculations, and risk exposure assessments. They weren't looking at me. They were looking through me, past me, into the company's decision-making process. Power had shifted, but quietly, no courtroom yet, no verdict, just a realization spreading through leadership that the system they relied on for protection now viewed them as a liability. Executives scrambled to assign blame without leaving fingerprints. Compliance tried to reconstruct timelines that no longer held. Legal stopped advising and started asking. Every answer created another question. Then came the final notice. The insurer escalated the file to regulatory review. That phrase landed heavier than any demand letter. Regulatory review doesn't mean resolution. It means oversight. It means reporting obligations, audits, and authorities who don't negotiate reputational comfort. It meant this would no longer stay inside boardrooms and legal memos. I felt the shift settle fully then. The leverage no longer belonged to personalities or titles. It belonged to processes, rules, and consequences that move forward without emotion. I hadn't forced that outcome. I had simply stopped shielding them from it. And once insurance steps aside, nothing important moves without permission again. I watched the balance tip without touching it. Fear traveled upward, not down. The higher the title, the less protection it offered. Systems answered only to rules. In that space between coverage and consequence, truth stopped being optional, and everyone understood that control had already left their hands. There was no appeal, no shortcut, and hiding place left. The board meeting didn't feel like a confrontation at first. It felt procedural, careful, almost polite. Questions arrived in measured tones, framed as requests for clarification rather than accusations. Ethan answered confidently, rehearsed, as if the room still belonged to him. They asked about timing, about authority, about why a termination had been processed during a medical emergency. Ethan leaned back and redirected the focus. He said human resources had acted independently. He suggested miscommunication. He implied overzealous compliance. Responsibility slid neatly away from him. I wasn't in the room, but I didn't need to be. The pattern was familiar. When pressure rises, blame moves downward. HR exists to absorb impact. Ethan counted on that. Rachel Moore was asked to respond. She didn't argue or defend herself. She opened her laptop and forwarded a single thread to the board's counsel. It contained clear instructions from Ethan, written hours before my termination. No ambiguity, no delegation, just direction. The temperature changed, the questions sharpened. Ethan's posture stiffened. He tried to reframe, explaining context, urgency, business necessity. None of it mattered anymore. The record had spoken. Once intent is documented, explanations sound like noise. There was no shouting, no dramatic interruption, just silence stretching longer than comfort allows. That silence pressed harder than any accusation. Ethan realized it too late. Board members began asking about oversight failures, risk exposure, and disclosure obligations. Ethan attempted to answer all of them at once. That only confirmed what they were already seeing. Control was slipping, and he knew it. Pressure builds slowly when people are trying to remain professional. It builds in pauses, in careful wording, in eyes dropping to notes instead of faces. I felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing the system was doing exactly what it was designed to do. Then, one director. older than the rest, stopped the discussion with a simple question. His voice wasn't angry. It was curious. How many times have we done this before? No one answered immediately. They didn't need to. The question had shifted the focus from a single incident to a pattern, from damage control to accountability. That was the moment the door closed behind Ethan, even though he was still sitting at the table. I imagined him understanding. Too late. That boards don't protect individuals, they protect continuity. Once risk outweighs loyalty, alignment evaporates. I took no pleasure in his discomfort, only a measured calm. This wasn't vengeance, it was gravity. Decisions fall back on those who make them. The pressure would not ease, it would spread, documented, reviewed, repeated. By the time the meeting ended, outcomes were already forming, quiet and unavoidable, moving forward without me, without noise, without permission, toward consequences no speech could reverse. I understood then that collapse rarely looks dramatic. It looks administrative, deliberate, and final, especially when silence replaces excuses and records refuse to cooperate under sustained scrutiny alone. If you leave here, you will miss the most important thing. The investigation widened without ceremony. What began as a review of my termination expanded into a methodical sweep, pulling files, emails, and approvals from years back. Each request arrived quietly, but together they formed a net the company couldn't outrun. I watched from a distance as investigators compared cases that shared uncomfortable similarities. Medical leaves followed by abrupt exits, benefits questioned at precise moments, dates nudged just enough to change outcomes. None of it looked dramatic alone, together. It formed a pattern that resisted denial. Names surfaced that I recognized, people who had vanished after accidents, diagnoses, or family crises. At the time, their departures were explained as restructuring or performance. Now the explanations collapsed under timestamps and internal notes. The same language appeared again and again, copied, adjusted, reused. Ethan's defense shifted as the scope grew. He stopped arguing facts and started arguing intent. He insisted every decision was isolated, reasonable, necessary. But systems don't evaluate intentions, they evaluate effects. And the effect was measurable harm, repeated across circumstances that should have triggered care, not calculation. The board no longer framed questions around me. They spoke about exposure, regulators, and long-term viability. Council outlined scenarios that assumed findings, not hypotheticals. The room had moved past debate into containment. That weight settled everywhere. Executives avoided eye contact, calendars cleared, committees formed with names like oversight and remediation, language hardened. There was no exit ramp back to normal operations. The investigation had momentum, and momentum doesn't negotiate. I felt the heaviness most in what didn't happen. No offers arrived, no quiet deals, no invitations to soften statements. Silence replaced outreach because options were disappearing. The company was preparing to survive the findings, not fight them. By then, Ethan had become something else, not a leader under pressure, but a risk vector documented across decisions. The word systemic appeared in briefings. Once it does, reversals stop mattering. Systems require correction, not persuasion. The directive came near the end of the week. Ethan was asked to step aside from day-to-day control while the review continued. It was presented as temporary, procedural, unavoidable. Titles remained. Authority did not. I didn't feel relief. I felt finality. When organizations reach this stage, outcomes stop belonging to people. They belong to process. What followed would move forward without anger, without apology, and without me. That was the point. I stayed attentive, tracking each notice and deadline as if monitoring weather. Nothing dramatic was required from me anymore. Gravity handled the rest. The evidence would be cataloged, cross-checked, and weighed by people with no stake in personalities. When that happens, stories end, policies begin, consequences follow. I accepted that distance, knowing the outcome no longer depended on argument, stamina, or will. It depended on records, and records do not get tired. They remain patient, consistent, exact, impartial, permanent, public, unforgiving, documented, dated, searchable, undeniable. When the settlement arrived, it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like punctuation. The company agreed to $10 million, acknowledged wrongful termination, and committed to remedial actions under council supervision. The language was dry, precise, final. I read it slowly, understanding what the number represented: lost income, medical exposure, punitive damages for bad faith. 10 million sounded loud to outsiders, but inside the process, it was the cheapest line item available. Money closes cases. Consequences keep score. The real cost followed immediately. Insurance coverage was withdrawn and could not be reinstated on reasonable terms. Projects stalled permanently. Partners revised contracts. Ratings agencies asked questions no press release could answer. Reputation, once cracked, does not reseal. Ethan's outcome arrived without drama. Regulators barred him from roles involving insurance and risk governance. Titles disappeared from bios. Speaking invitations evaporated. The ban wasn't personal, it was administrative. Systems don't shame, they restrict. People assumed I would return. Some thought it was leverage, others called it reconciliation. The offer came politely, with assurances and a redesigned role. I declined without negotiation. Going back would have blurred accountability, and clarity mattered more than comfort. Justice, I learned, isn't loud. It's decisive. It closes doors that shouldn't reopen and leaves space for healthier ones. I signed the final pages, thanked counsel, and stepped away. 10 million was the cheap part. The expensive part was rebuilding trust without shortcuts for everyone left behind. I chose distance, not bitterness. Distance keeps lessons intact. As I walked forward, I carried no trophy, only a record that would outlast personalities. That was enough. I understood then why finality matters. Settlements end disputes, but accountability reshapes behavior. Employees watched leadership change, policies tighten, approvals slow, training replaced slogans, oversight replaced shortcuts. The company learned, publicly, that health crises are not optimization opportunities. I learned privately that restraint is strength. I didn't celebrate. Because celebration invites relapse, I documented. Because documentation endures. Friends asked if I felt whole again. Healing isn't symmetry, it's direction. I chose forward motion, careful and unhurried, letting outcomes speak without my voice. Justice didn't restore my job, and it didn't need to. It restored boundaries. When boundaries return, dignity follows. I closed my file, shut my laptop, and turned toward work that didn't require sacrificing my body to protect someone else's numbers. That decision cost nothing and paid everything. I moved on deliberately, choosing steadier work, consistent care, and leaders who measure success without exploiting silence. The case became a reference point, not a scar. I let it teach, then closed it, confident that fairness, once enforced, doesn't need retelling. It simply stands, documented, dated, and ready whenever memory fades or excuses reappear again today. I didn't celebrate when it was over. There was no champagne moment, no urge to look back. What settled instead was something quieter, a sense that the system had finally done its job without needing my anger to fuel it. I learned that protection doesn't belong only to people with titles or leverage. It belongs to those who understand how rules actually work, and who are patient enough to let process replace impulse. I never needed power. I needed clarity, documentation, and time. Ethan faded from the industry the way numbers disappear from reports when they no longer balance. No announcements, no redemption arc, just absence. Systems don't punish out of spite. They correct and move on. Recovery came slowly. I followed it deliberately. I chose work that respected limits, doctors who insisted on rest, and days that didn't require proving my worth through exhaustion. Starting again wasn't dramatic. It was steady. This wasn't a victory story. It was a correction. I didn't win. The system corrected itself, exactly as it was designed to do when people misuse it. They didn't lose because I fought back. They lost because they tried to save money the wrong way. In the end, I spent years believing that if I just worked harder, stayed later, carried more weight, I'd be safe. I wasn't. What saved me wasn't authority or anger. It was understanding my rights, respecting my limits, and letting systems do what they're meant to do when we stop protecting people who misuse them. There's something humbling about lying still and realizing the world keeps moving without you. It strips away ego fast. What comes back, slowly, is perspective. You start to see that dignity isn't proven by sacrifice alone, and loyalty doesn't mean letting your health collapse in silence. Real professionalism includes knowing when to stop, when to document, and when to protect yourself without apology. If you've stayed with me this far, thank you. Truly. And let me ask you something personal. Have you checked in with your own health lately? not in a dramatic way, just something simple and real, like booking a routine checkup or finally taking that lingering symptom seriously instead of brushing it off. Sometimes prevention is the quietest form of self-respect. I'm curious, where are you listening from right now? Different places, different lives, but so many shared experiences hiding behind office doors and polite emails. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment, share what stood out, or pass this along to someone who might need it. A like or a share helps these stories reach people who feel alone in moments like this. And if you want to stay with me for more stories about work, life, and the quiet ways justice shows up, consider subscribing. The conversation doesn't end here, it's just getting more honest.